I'm going to try something a little different tonight and share a story with you that someone else wrote. This was written in 1959 by Hildegarde Dolson. She was born and raised in Venango County and moved to New York City. She lived in the village and became a best-selling author. For many years, she was determined not to write about oil history, but thankfully, she changed her mind. She returned here in the early 50s, and she wrote The Great Oildorado. So here we go with Chapter 1. Unlike Texas, which has always been too big for its boots, the people of my home county, Venango, in western Pennsylvania, never expected the eyes of the world to be on them. After it happened, they were cocky enough, but I think their descendants have been entirely too small-mouthed in bragging about it. I have actually met people who think the first oil well was drilled in Texas. But the truth is that Texas was still a big old dry hole when our quiet little farming county became an uproar in 1859. I have to admit that Venangoites fought this off as long as possible. In my hometown of Franklin, for instance, a workman digging along French Creek in 1832 for the new canal kept turning up thick black oil until he got so enraged at it mucking up his good dirt and his water that he flung his shovel and his oily clothes into the creek, and he marched off to get drunk. According to an old town ordinance, whosoever became publicly intoxicated had to do penance by digging up a tree stump from the town square. For all I know, the workman doing penance with a hangover and digging down to hell and gone to uproot an old elm stump may have dug up oil again and been so irritated that he went off and got drunk again. Not that I mean to imply that Venangoites were a bad lot. Heaven forbid. People went to church twice a day on Sunday, and they read their Bibles every night by candle or lard lamp, and they drank mostly good cold well water. Whenever a man dug a new well in his yard and the water tasted oily, he had his neighbor's sympathy if he went so far as to mention his bad luck in actually striking oil. There was a brilliant judge who moved into the county seat about 1840, and he hired a laborer to dig a water well. After getting down 30 feet, the workman struck a vein of oil, and it flowed in so fast that he went hollering for the judge to come help. They did everything they could think of to stop the oil flowing, but finally they had to abandon the well. A friend of the judge said that the dignitary expressed his indignation pretty freely with very choice language over the nasty, stinking Seneca oil. So, Western Pennsylvanians didn't exactly strive toward their destiny or even like the smell of it coming. In the summer of 1859, the editor of the Venango Spectator, the only newspaper in the county, heard that some ex-railroad conductor named Drake was deliberately trying to drill an oil well about 20 miles away near Titusville. He refused to report on such foolishness in the columns of his 4-page weekly. He felt that the farmers who read the Spectator were more concerned about the weather and the black frost. It had been the worst June in the county's history, blighting the oats, wheat, potatoes, and rye that normally harvested a yearly income of around $250. At that time, a farmer could raise a family quite comfortably on that much money. In this up and down country where there were hills protected by dark pine and hemlock trees, there were all kinds of game from fat rabbits to white-tailed deer to timber wolves that brought a state bounty for each pelt, and of course some screeching wildcats. The sawmills, they screeched too, because next to farming, lumbering was the main business. The logs were hauled to nearby Allegheny River and floated by raft about 100 miles down to Pittsburgh. And many of the farmers made extra cash by selling off their timber or using their team and wagon to haul for the most prosperous lumber concern around. It was named the Brewer, and it was on Watson Flats outside of Titusville. It was on a piece of brewer's land that the crazy Yankee Drake had erected a weird wooden structure, tapering to the tip about 30 feet high, which he called a derrick. But the amused farmers and gawkers that summer called it plenty else. Perhaps he still thought striking oil was a nuisance, for the editor of the Spectator newspaper refused to print the story when the oil well came in on August 27th. And it was probably the most important industrial event of the century, and certainly the most important to ever hit Venango County. The first week after the strike, the astonished farmers who owned the land along Oil Creek were being courted with more greenbacks than they'd ever seen in their entire lives. And still no word of the story in the Spectator newspaper. It was word of mouth that spread the oil excitement, even along the prison grapevine. 2 crooks, Stover and Walker, held for larceny in the county jail in Franklin, escaped that week from a padlocked cell with 3 feet thick and sheet iron ceiling. They set fire to the end of a plank and used it as a blowtorch to melt a hole in the ceiling to crawl through. Apparently, the petty crooks were trying to find their way to Oil Creek to cash in on all the oil excitement. And finally, on September 21st, the editor mentioned in print what everybody already knew. And he used a warmed-over scoop that he took from his rival at the New York Tribune. And it had been printed on September 13th. On page 5, the story of the discovery of oil was tucked next to an article about a flying machine man named Cook, who was building an aerial car that was expected to navigate the air at will with an inconceivable velocity. Wait a sec, just a minute. The flying machine man. I'm not familiar with that, so I may have to research that a bit. Might have another story there. That's a future video. Anyway, just below the flying machine man was this story: Discovery of Subterranean Fountain of Oil. Titusville, September 8, 1859. Of course, that's just a byline date. That's not the date it happened. Anyway, perhaps you will recollect that in 1854 there was organized in the city of New York a company under the name of Pennsylvania Rock Oil, which for some good reason passed into the hands of some New Haven capitalists. In 1858, the directors leased the grounds and the springs to Mr. Edwin Drake, well known on the New Haven Railroad. He came out here and in May last commenced to bore for salt, or to find the source of the oil, which is so common along the banks of Oil Creek. Last week, at the depth of 71 feet. Wait a minute, I always thought it was 69 and a half. Right, well, he struck a fissure in the rock through which he was boring when, to surprise and joy of everyone, he found that he had tapped a vein of water and oil, yielding 400 gallons of pure oil every 24 hours. The excitement on this discovery of this vast source of oil was fully equal to what I saw in California when a large lump of gold was accidentally turned out. And that's the end of the first chapter. All right, let's see. That was only, we're only at 10 minutes. I think I'll keep going just a little bit longer. Let's go into chapter 2 and just see how much we can get done here in a couple, maybe 10 more minutes, okay? In all the excitement after his well came in, poor Edwin Drake got shoved aside and nearly lost in the rush. He was the hero, all right, but one of those heroes who seems to have been chosen in a game of blindfold. To tell you the truth, if this were fiction, I'd invent a new hero, one more in the style to which we're accustomed in glossy novels with large, firm sins and virtues. In my hurry to get past Drake now to the people, and some villains included who interest me much more, I'm apt to shove him aside too, impatiently, as his contemporaries did. And that isn't fair. He deserves his own chapter, but he'll have to share even that. It took a trio of New Englanders, a doctor, a lawyer, and a banker, to propel the railroad conductor into that one larger-than-life act. In fact, there are those who say that the other three men were the heroes. Since 1859, there have been so many fierce arguments about who really deserves credit for discovering oil. It only seems sensible to point out that nobody discovered oil. The truth is large enough that Drake was probably the first man to carry through with a practical method for drilling it and pumping it out of the earth. But the new liquid wealth had been around for a long time. Job in the Bible talked of the rock that poured out rivers of oil. And the first writer to pour it on troubled waters was the Roman historian, who said that everything is soothed by oil. And a once bright-eyed tourist named Marco Polo reported in the 14th century that the oil from the Caspian Sea was used to cure the distempers in men and camels. Even a few centuries later, British and French explorers sent back eager accounts from this country of the oil pools that looked like water and burned like brandy. But nobody seemed to care then. Lewis Evans drew a map of the middle British colonies in America in 1755, and he very carefully lettered on it Petroleum in Pennsylvania, near the spot where Seneca and Corn Planter Indians used to spread their blankets on the water to collect it. And they used it for liniment and medicine and to mix with their war paint for their glistening waterproof makeup. The great chief corn planter left off his war paint and was friendly to our side during the Revolutionary War in gratitude over a brand new government gave him 300 acres in Venango County. And the settlement of shanties that clung onto the hills like barnacles just above Oil Creek was called Corn Planter. And long after the chief sold the land in 1818, it eventually became known as Oil City. And lastly, the oil was reported on a Revolutionary land grant from 1785 by General Benjamin Lincoln. And he reported that in the northern part of Pennsylvania there is a creek called Oil Creek, which empties itself into the Allegheny, on top of which floats an oil, from which gallons can be collected by man in one day. The settlers in western Pennsylvania had already discovered the Seneca oil and skimmed up wherever it appeared and kept it in a jar in their households. And even the druggists were touting it as a cure-all for just about everything. Even though the housewives thought the Seneca oil was good, they didn't realize just how good until they saw the gaudy testimonials that Sam Kerr put on the half-pint bottles of crude petroleum that he was selling around 1850. Now, I did do a video on Sam Kerr, and I maybe put a card here right now if you want to go look at it. But it went on, this goes on to say that Kerr was a big, brisk, curly-haired man who was very confident. He had operated a successful chain of canal boats between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and he owned a share of his father's salt wells. And like all the other salt well owners around Tarentum, just above Pittsburgh, the Kerrs were plagued with the ugly, smelly grease that often appeared in their wells and polluted their brine. They cursed it and ran it off into the canal, and Sam Kerr put it on the market as Kerr's Rock Oil. He sold it as a nature's remedy from 400 feet below the Earth's surface. It cost 50 cents a half pint, and Kerr recommended 3 teaspoons 3 times a day. Oh my God, I still can't imagine taking that crude oil by spoon. surely enough to choke a horse or galvanize an invalid into leaping up and down. And he actually claimed that it made the lame walk and the blind could see. It would have taken a blind man to miss seeing the gaudy, gilded wagons that Kerr sent rolling through the countryside to peddle his oil, each with huge hand-painted renditions on the wagon sides of green and crimson. Pictured was the Good Samaritan leaning over a wounded soldier lying under a palm tree, presumably offering the poor devil Kerr's oil. Despite all his posters and his traveling wagons, Kerr couldn't unload enough of the 50-cent miracle cure to get rid of all the oil. And soon he had another dazzling idea of trying to refine it as a substitute for the new coal oil, or for the expensive whale oil being used in lamps. There was certainly no problem in making it burn, but the trouble was the smell. A nasty smelling medicine may be reassuring to some, but as an illuminant that smoked and smelled so bad it drove the user out of their house with burning eyes and flared nostrils. So Kerr consulted a chemist who advised him to distill the crude oil at a high heat enough to remove the offending vapors. But when the still was built at 7th Avenue near Grant Street in Pittsburgh, it raised an even worse stink. Outraged neighbors complained to the magistrate that even if they didn't expire from the foul odor, they would burn up by the explosive stuff. So Kerr had to move his still outside the city limits, but he kept on brewing, and soon he was selling the carbon oil at $1.50 a gallon. And although he had found a way to mute the aroma, there were still customers who took one sniff, shuddered, and demanded their money back. Ebenezer Brewer, the senior partner in the lumber mill just below Titusville, skimmed up about 5 gallons from the seepage on his land that was bordering Oil Creek, and he sent it by coach to his son Francis, a new young doctor who was starting his practice in Vermont. And Ebenezer told his son to prescribe this oil to anyone who needs it. Francis Brewer listened to his father, and apparently it proved to be exactly the sort of unpleasant medicine that everyone in Vermont was crazy about. So young Brewer took a flask of the crude oil down to his old professor, Dr. Dixie Crosby, who examined it and agreed it might be a pretty good thing. The flask was sitting on Crosby's desk when another graduate, George Bissell, who was now a young lawyer, came back to school for a visit. And he had already heard about Kerr's lamp oil. And now as he listened to Crosby talk about it and all the interesting content, he quivered like a bird dog who caught the scent of new game. Bissell, now in his early 30s, had already hurled through several careers as a reporter, professor, a high school principal, and he had come most recently into law. And he looked like a cartoon of a poet, with the long black tossed hair and a beard that looked pasted on, kind of villainous, scowling eyebrows, and snapping dark eyes. It was possible to imagine him performing at a fever pitch for a jury to defend a widow who hadn't known that the gun was loaded. But matter-of-fact legal duties bored him. He and his new partner in New York hadn't so much practiced law as promoted the laws of chance in handling stock for such firms as the American and Foreign Iron Pavement Company. So now they leaped into action and bought 100 acres of the Brewer Timber Company at Watson Flats. They agreed to pay $5,000 each, and the company was capitalized at $250,000 on paper, and one share would sell at $25 if they ever found a buyer. But even the most gullible refused to take a chance on anything so silly. Gold, yes. Iron, yes. But who wanted oil? Not they. And the prospects for the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company looked dim. And the people back in Titusville dubbed it as a fancy stock company and laughed over what those fool city people could actually think up. A New York merchant who Bissell had approached about buying the stock wrote back to the brewers in Titusville and said, "From what little I have seen of them and their transactions, I have no confidence in them as a businessman, would not trust them without security." At this time, Bissell went to Yale and hired the top chemist in the country, Professor Benjamin Silliman, to analyze the oil, make a detailed report of its potential, especially for lighting. The professor worked on this for at least a year. By then, Dr. Francis Brewer had already left Vermont medicine back to Titusville and became a partner in his father's lumber business. The firm at that point engaged a local man named Jacob to he did dig series of trenches to collect the oil already being used at the mill, the huge circular saw, and to burn in lamps there. At Bissell's urging, Dr. Brewer shipped 3 barrels of this oil via the Erie Canal to Broadway, where his offices were at the corner of Broadway and Franklin. Both lawyers were away when the oil was delivered, so the young delivery man dumped it in barrels on the sidewalk out front and drove off. The law office was on the second floor, and it had tenants downstairs, and the tenants were a publishing company and bookseller, D. Appleton & Co., and they were left holding the barrels that were blocking their elegant doorway while the oil sat oozing in the sun. And they had just opened their elaborate new store on the first floor of the building with a display of rare books and fine prints that was attracting a lot of the trade. And it is the alleged publishers that had a hypersensitive nose, and the customers who came in past those barrels holding their noses, and one had to brandish smelling salts, as she said the vapors were so nauseating, that drove Mr. Appleton into action. He rushed out and demanded quickly, "Take these away." The delivery man did just that. It took Bissell 3 weeks to locate his missing oil barrels, and they found them on a dock at a warehouse, at a dock. He brought 1 barrel back to his second floor office so that he would have a sample for possible purchasers of stock. He may have considered asking the downstairs tenant to purchase his stock in his company, but that soon was put to rest. The oil had leaked through the newly decorated white ceiling below and dribbled onto some of the most costly bindings and books. And Appleton wanted damages. Bissell was so broke, he was already dashing all over the city trying to raise enough capital to pay the professor for his work. And the professor refused to hand over any of his findings or any of his detailed analysis until he got paid $526 in full. Now, Bissell already had a hint from the professor that the oil was favorable for burning as a lamp oil. This wedded him into getting the money, or rather persuading his partner to pay up out of his own pocket. And then they finally paid the professor, and the report was worth every penny. It gave the results of the test and comparisons. A few sentences must have been enough to convince Bissell that he could outshine Aladdin. And it read, "I have submitted the lamp-burning petroleum to the inspection of the most experienced lampists who were accessible to me. Our testimony was that the lamp burning this fluid gave as much light as any we have seen. As the oil does not gum or become acid or rancid by exposure, possesses in that, well as it is a wonderful resistance to the extreme cold, a very important quality as a lubricant. In conclusion, gentlemen, it appears to me there is much ground for encouragement in the belief that your company have in their possession a raw material from which, by simple and not expensive process, they may manufacture very valuable products. Now Silliman himself was so enthusiastic that he consented briefly to be the president of the company. Since he was one of Yale's most distinguished gentlemen, the citizens of New Haven began to look at him and the company. And a banker, James Townsend, who was head of City Savings Bank, decided to try his luck and invest into the newly formed company. And they changed the name to the Seneca Oil Company. And in the parlor of the New Haven boarding house where Townsend lived, he talked about his new scheme with a fellow boarder, a courtly, frail-looking man, about 38 years old, by the name of Edwin Drake. Now, it's rather mystifying why a bank president should have scraped the bottom of the barrel that he persuaded an ailing railroad conductor on the New Haven Railroad to invest almost all of his entire savings, $200, into the venture. What's even more mystifying is that Drake was elected president of the company and giving a large block of stock and then promptly relieved of it. Townsend, who wore high stiff collars and kept his lips tight in public, later admitted that it didn't do well for a banker to have his name attached openly to such a chancy project, but he was perfectly willing to own all the stock he could acquire cheap behind the scenes. On the letterhead of the new Seneca Oil Company, the new president, in name only, wrote out a memo to directors. And in it, he gave 2,700 shares of stock to James Townsend. Yeah, he gave it all away. I don't know. Obviously, they chose Drake for a reason, but maybe we'll find out. I don't know. The value received was a job. Drake was to go to Titusville and act as the general agent of this company to raise and dispose of oil with a salary of $1,000 for the year, the date of which was April 1st. Oh, April Fool's Day. April Fool's Day, 1858. That must be why they call it Drake's Folly. Fool's Day. Okay. Okay, now Drake was already too ill with spinal arthritis to walk up and down the aisles of a train to collect tickets. And now he was going to take off to an obscure part of Pennsylvania to run a hellish obstacle race over a course that he'd never even tried out for. The one thing he knew for certain was that it was a hard place to get to, because he'd already made one quick survey trip, traveling free on his railroad pass. And now he was going to return with his second wife, Laura, and his small daughter. And I think I'll stop right there. There's many pages left in this chapter, and I think that's a good breaking point. We introduce the oil, and we know who the players are who sent Drake to Titusville, and when I return in the next video, we'll talk about the discovery. Have a good evening, and thanks for watching. That's all.